Hello and welcome to this week's episode. This week we have not one, but we have two guests, which is a first and very exciting. I'm talking to two of the authors of Perspectives on Giftedness, which is a book by GHF Press that was released recently. Now, this book has a whole bunch of articles within it, and a whole bunch of authors have contributed to it. And it's a really awesome book. I've read it, and each of these articles, like, they just pack a punch. I have not read one yet where I haven't kind of had this lovely aha moment or just taken away something really profound. So it's a wonderful book, and I'm really excited to be talking about it and talking to two of those authors. So today we talk to Kathleen Humble and Dr. Rebecca Farley. Now, Kathleen is an author. She's also written another book. She is a homeschooling mum. She has ADHD. She has two wonderful, twice exceptional children, and in a past life has been a mathematician, computer programmer, and children's entertainer. And Dr. Rebecca Farley is also an avid writer. She's got a Masters and a Doctorate in Media and Cultural Studies. She's been a teacher and a researcher and editor. And when she became a mum of what she says, two anarchists, she realized that she's actually growing and having way more fun than she ever did at uni. And it was really lovely to meet Kathleen and Rebecca and just feel like, honestly, these are my people. We talk about a whole bunch of different things. We talk about the different definitions of giftedness, asynchronous development, ADHD, autism, letting go as a parent, being twice exceptional, finding out, the absence of girls in ADHD and ASD research, and a whole bunch of other things. They've, between them, written about 5 different articles that are in the book. So we touch on a few different topics, and it's a really great conversation. And it was just a really lovely moment to be talking to two other mums who are just having this shared experience. And there were so many moments when Kathleen was talking or Rebecca was talking, and I'm just sitting here going, yep, I can totally resonate with that. So it was just a really, I guess, comforting conversation. And I hope that you find it comforting as well. I think it's really important that we are able to listen to these stories from other parents and people going on that journey, because I think it helps us to resonate and see ourselves in those stories. And I think this is a real episode for that opportunity to see yourself in someone else's story. So let me know what you thought about this episode once you've listened to it. And you can subscribe to ourgiftedkids.com and you will get episodes straight into your inbox. You can like our Facebook page. We're on Instagram. We have a free Facebook group. Connect, join in, and let us know what you think. What did you get out of this episode? Because I thought it was really awesome. There's also lots of resources and things that come up, and so there's heaps of information in the show notes to check out. So jump online, connect with Our Gifted Kids, and let me know what you thought. So I'll let you go. I hope you enjoy this episode. Bye. Hi, I'm Sophia Elliott. As a parent of 3 gifted kids, I'm here to talk about all things gifted, because I've been isolated and uncertain, and I felt like that parent. Then I found peace of mind, support, and my community. This podcast is about sharing that journey, actually parenting gifted kids, and connecting with advice and support. So we have everything we need for every member of our family to thrive. This is the Our Gifted Kid podcast. Today we're talking to 2 contributors from a new book out of the GHF Press, Perspectives on Giftedness, Sound Advice from Parents and Professionals. And it talks about what is gifted all about. Some of the most popular writers in the gifted community aim to answer aspects of that question in this book. And I have read it, and I have to say it is brilliant. The chapters or articles tend to be about, a 10-minute read or something, and they pack a punch. And I don't think I've walked away from an article without going, oh my God, yes, or just finding that thing that someone else says that really resonates with you. And it's kind of like, there it is in writing and reference. And it's like, that's amazing. So the book is essays from parents who have been there, educators who are working to get it right, and psychologists and other professionals who understand that rich complexity that is so often part and parcel of giftedness. So wisdom, wit, oodles of compassion, the writers cover all sorts of topics. And I'd like to introduce two of our writers today. Firstly, Kathleen Humble, who is an author and homeschooling mum with ADHD. She has two wonderful, twice exceptional children, and in a past life, she was also a mathematician, computer programmer, and a children's entertainer. She has a number of publications, including Gifted Myths, an easy-to-read guide to the myths, science, and history of the gifted and twice exceptional. And her website, Yellow Readers, combines two of her great passions, writing and advocating for homeschooling gifted and 2E children. So, Kathleen, welcome to the podcast. And I've got to say that your book is now on my to-read list, because when I saw that it explored the history, I was like, yes, because I read Neurotribes recently, which is a great history of autism. And I was like, someone needs to do this for giftedness. So I'm like, great, Kathleen's done it. I can't wait to read that.
Thank you. Well, hopefully you'll enjoy the read.
Yeah, definitely.
I can't say it's as extensive as Neurotribes, which is an amazing book.
A few books are as extensive as that book, but no, it'll be great to read a bit about the history of giftedness. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for letting me come on your program.
And Rebecca Farley is an avid writer with a Masters and Doctoral degrees in Media and Cultural Studies. She's been a teacher, researcher, and editor in Australia and the UK, all of which shifted when she became a mum of, in her words, two anarchists. And after 10 years has realised that she's learning, growing, and having way more fun than she ever did at uni, and has found that she doesn't need those qualifications to speak and justify her writing. And so, Rebecca, huge welcome. And I've got to say that when I interview people for the podcast, I'm never quite sure, who I'm going to get. And I've always been a bit awkward in meeting new people. Yeah. But firstly, every podcast guest I've ever had has been so lovely. But secondly, when I read that your blog about your challenges with executive function that describes the carnage of your house, I thought, I'm going to be fine. These are my people. I've been decluttering for the entire 7 years I've been in this house. And this podcast is very much about that question of finding my voice and combating that feeling of needing permission or that external validation through qualifications to talk and discuss these issues. So thank you very much. That's really empowering, and welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So that's enough of me talking. Let's get started with perhaps you guys just telling us a little bit about yourselves. How did you get into the gifted thing? What you're currently up to aside from writing chapters for perspectives. And I'll just throw it over to Kathleen. Do you want to start us off?
Okay. Yeah, so, well, I didn't intend to get involved in the gifted community. I don't think there are many parents who actually do, but it started when my son was very young. He was a toddler, and he started doing things that were way out of the norm, very much completely out of the norm. Reading at 2 and writing at 2.5, and finding him reading biology textbooks before he hit school, university biology textbooks. And along with that, he has a range of different disabilities as well, which are an arm long and actually go outside of my ability to remember the list of all the things he's been diagnosed with over the years. So I kind of crash dived into it because he didn't fit any of the expectations of all of the parent books that I'd had, and I had nowhere to go. No idea what I was doing. And then I started reading about giftedness, and then when my daughter came along, things came to a head. I realized I had 2 children who were just outside the norm, and I started homeschooling my son. And that's when I started writing about it. So that's where the blog started. I used to call it Gluten-Free Mum, but it's always been Yellow Readers, but the title was Gluten-Free Mum. It was meant to be a recipe blog, and it didn't stay that way. It ended up being homeschooling and twice exceptional and gifted stuff, because that's where we ended up. And yeah, over the years, I've roped in my research skills from when I was failing to do my PhD, and was able to do the kind of things that I realized I had skills that other parents didn't have, in terms of being able to read through a journal article and know how to find systemic reviews and know where to look and how to extract things. That's the skill set most people didn't have. And I started to write about what those things were saying, and also what they weren't saying and where the gap was, and ended up with GHF eventually. So that's kind of where I am. I started working in mathematics, homeschooled, and then ended up a writer by accident.
I love life's accidents, though. That's always the interesting thing, where you ended up. I can guarantee you this was never in my plans. Podcast on giftedness. What? So, Rebecca, how about you? Tell us a little bit about you.
When I look back, I can see all kinds of markers in my kids' early years that I just didn't know. I had not enough experience with children, so I didn't know they were doing anything odd until, I can remember my 2-year-old on my hip at a petting zoo, and she pointed at a baby calf and she said, "That is my favorite. It is the most adorable creature." And this grandmother who was standing beside me pulled a face and she said, "How old is she?" And I said, "Well, she just turned 2 last month." And she said, "She's a bit young for words like that." And I kind of remember filing it away thinking, well, who makes those rules? They're stupid. But I ignored everything because I was just coping. And then when we got to school, one of the teachers at school, actually, she was a teacher who'd gone away to have babies, and then she would come back to teaching again. But her oldest had started at the school, and she used to be there a lot because he had anxiety. And she saw my kids and she said, I don't remember how the conversation started, but she said, "Your kids are so gifted." And I said, "No, they're not." And she said, "Trust me." I did not know she had an MEd in gifted education. And she said, "With some kids, we wonder a bit. With yours, it's really clear." And I really didn't want to hear that. I had a friend whose children were exactly the same as mine, and you could put all 4 children in a room, and we used to joke about it was just a bag of traits that they'd all be swimming around in. And there were some differences. My child had chronic illness that meant he just hated school, whereas her oldest, she's quite classically autistic. She'll sit down to have a conversation with you, and her mum has to say, "Remember, we face people that we're talking." She's not about eye contact, but just even body orientation. But apart from that, when you got them together, the sense of humor, the way they zinged ideas off each other, the out there-ness of the ideas. And this mum was getting her kids tested and coming up with results that I was just had my fingers in my ears about. And I think we were a couple of years into school, and it was just such a battle and so pear-shaped, and I could not figure it out. And one day I thought, I better find out something about this gifted malarkey. So I looked up a YouTube video, Heidi Class Gable's one about gifted young children and creativity. And that was not just about my kids, it was about me. So much, it gave me a fright, and I slammed the laptop shut. And the reason that I'd had my fingers in my ears, metaphorically, for a couple of years was I was identified as a gifted kid, and that had been a miserable experience. It was all about you're really smart, therefore you must achieve. And I did not want that for my kids. And I did not want my kids to have that kind of expectation when they were also had all this weird emotional stuff going on all the time. And that intensity, Gable talks about that stuff, and that's where I was going, oh, you mean these two things go together? And that's when I started to read. Yeah, I can't even remember what I started to read, but the more I read, oh, this is us. Oh, this is us. And now my son is now 14 and my daughter is 12. And I've been looking and looking. I think we are 2E. I think I am ADHD. I think my daughter is ADHD. Those are revelations. I absolutely hear you with, 52 years old going, you mean there's a reason I've been struggling all my life?
Yeah.
Who knew?
It's a shock, right? Yeah.
It is, yeah. It's a really good way to get imposter syndrome is to go, well, everybody says I'm smart, but yet I cannot keep the same thought in my head for 10 minutes at a time. What's going on there?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I wanted to get into writing about the chaos and the intensity of the emotional stuff because everybody looks at the high achieving and the educational stuff and says that's what gifted is, but actually the emotional stuff, the sensitivities and the imagination, for us, that's the stuff that's in your face far more than the intelligence. So Kathleen's chapter on gifted versus gifted was spot on. It was one of the first things I read when it was a blog post, and I thought, oh, yes, this person gets it.
Yeah, 100%. And that was actually my next question. Well, it was to say that, so between the two of you, you've written 5 chapters or articles within the book, Perspectives on Giftedness. And so collectively, they're about what is gifted, what is asynchronous development, and what it's like living with it. Twice exceptional being hard to diagnose, particularly ADHD and autism in gifted kids, and that most gifted kids, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, have never been studied. So within your articles, there's quite a breadth of issues there. And so let's kind of start with what Rebecca has said there, because Kathleen, in your article, Gifted versus Gifted, I love that you sort of kind of say, actually, we're not all talking about the same group of kids, that your first step is actually to go, right, well, who are we talking about? Can you start us off and elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think this really started for me when I started talking to researchers. Particularly, I went to a gifted conference that was in Sydney quite a few years back. And I noticed that though everyone in the conference was there for gifted things, they had actually streamed it. So there were 2 completely separate streams. And then I'd also, when I was reading through the papers that I was researching for various things, I noticed that every single research paper would start out with, there are many definitions of giftedness and it's always confusing, blah, blah, blah. And then they'd go, and for our paper, we will use this. But every time that this was only one of 3 or maybe 4 different definitions. And so you had what I'd call the educationally gifted, which is your E-gifted, which is usually what they talk about in schools. It's the top 10% of kids. They excel. They're really, really good at academics. There's some good studies to say they'll do well in life. They're well-rounded. And that's one group of gifted kids, but that's got very little, if anything, to do with IQ tests. Then you had what I call the psychologically gifted, which is the stuff that psychologists study. So they've created dozens of different IQ tests and they're trying to figure out how the brain works and all the different visual, spatial versus auditory processing, different ways that your brain works. And when they're talking gifted, it's a completely different group of kids. They need acceleration, particularly if they're highly to profoundly gifted, and they tend to not necessarily do well in school. And I thought that was fascinating. When you actually look at it, You've got one group saying gifted kids are disadvantaged, they're not given a chance to do well, they're held back. And then you've got another group saying they're well-rounded and they do well. And you go, how do these two things mesh? And the answer is, for the most part, they don't, except for that little bit in the middle, which is where we actually get our long-term longitudinal studies, where they actually follow a large group of children for a long time. Terman is, of course, the first one. But all of those studies, they start with the teacher picking out the kids, and then they'll run IQ tests on them and take the ones with a high IQ out. So they're both E-gifted and P-gifted. And that's pretty much where all of the research on high IQ being high achieving comes from. And then outside of all of those, you've got 2E, which is gifted and disabled. So they have a mental or physical disability or both, and that impacts on their ability to show their giftedness in many situations. So they can mask it, where the giftedness hides the disability because they don't, they look average. Or it can destructively interact, where the poor executive functioning, non-emotional regulation, and the giftedness brain, which has a more emotional reaction to stimuli, clash. I think I said it was like the Ferrari with no brakes, which I borrowed from one of the researchers in the US, used that in a talk I went to, and I thought that is perfect.
Yeah.
When you actually have a look at all of those, you can't just go gifted, you're going to go which gifted, because until you know that, you can't know how to help those kids. It's not necessarily that one group is more important or less important than the other, but you can't just lump them all in and give them the same program, because it's not going to work. Anyway, I hope
100%. Yeah, I could not agree more. When I first got on this kind of gifted journey, it's very hard to figure it out, because, like you say, people are talking about actually different groups of kids. And so as a parent, when you're looking for those answers out there, you've actually got to be lucky enough to, I think, see yourself in other people's stories and go, actually, that's the group we're in. I don't know what that's called, but I resonate with that story, that journey. And Rebecca, in your article, you talk about the asynchronicity, of the development of gifted kids. And I've got a section here that I might read out, if that's okay, because it just says it so well. I think it's actually 3 little bits that I've taken. But so, Rebecca, you say, not only had I walloped my sisters, and the fact that I could wallop my sisters came as a giant shock to all of us. It terrified the crap out of me, and I burst into tears every bit as loud as theirs. I was a monster. That's asynchronous development. That's the reason parents of gifted kids clutch their gin. At any moment, your hitherto rational, advanced, and well-adjusted child may suddenly be taken over by a foaming poltergeist of their much younger selves, or, as in my case, a developmental stage that seemingly skipped altogether. And it's like, oh yeah. And therein lies the challenge. And like you say, the complexity of giftedness. It's that asynchronicity. And so often people are talking about the educationally gifted or the E-gifted that you were talking about, Kathleen, but not understanding that, the psychologically gifted, actually there's this whole myriad of challenges that confront that. Yeah. Rebecca, did you want to share with us some of your thoughts about that asynchronous development?
I've got 2 thoughts, and they're quite contradictory. The first one is, since I wrote that and since I submitted it, I've come across Russell Barclay's work on ADHD, and I don't even remember what video it was that I saw, where he talked about mad flashes of temper just out of the blue, and how it's very hard for people with ADHD to manage it because they don't even see it coming. They're just blindsided. And I thought, actually, that probably sounds a lot like what happened to me. I was 9, so I remember that night pretty well. I really didn't see it coming. It wasn't like you know, I had the time to go, okay, take some deep breaths or remove yourself from the scene. It's just, you know, somebody said the wrong thing, and the next thing I know, I was beating my sisters over the head with a broom. So I'm more confused now. I mean, the line between giftedness and other neurodiverse traits, it's a wide and fuzzy border. And now I wonder, how much is that asynchronicity and how much of that is what I think I'm probably now looking at is that I'm ADHD. But having said that, going back to Kathleen's point, you know, for my kids, they read early and easily, not as early as Kathleen's, but early and easily. They could, in their first term at school, they were both identified as, okay, you guys are reading at the level we expect you to read when you leave school. Great. But they didn't want to. They didn't want to go to school. They didn't want to do what anyone else asked them to. They were emotionally way behind what their brains said they could do. And that for me was always the really biggest struggle, was trying to, at 4 or 5, you should be going to school. You should want to play with other children. Why do you still want to sit on my lap all day? And that asynchronous development, that constant juggling between where their emotions are and where their brains are, that has been the biggest challenge for me, because all of society has this idea that development is quite concrete and quite, you know, Piaget with his developmental stages, this happens and then this happens and then this happens. And by 12, you magically don't need to play anymore and you don't need this, and you don't, you know. And that's just so much not what was happening in my house. I had people who were scared of the dark until they were over 10. I had people who were scared of being anywhere without me, way past the age where I thought that should be a thing. And taking my expectations from society out of it and just going, oh, okay, this is where you are. I have to meet you where you are. That has been the biggest challenge, being where they are, not where school or psychologists tell me they should be, because they're not. Sometimes they are, or in some ways they are. You know, I had a 9-year-old who wanted to know everything about the First Crusade and who point blank refused to go to a friend's house for a play date. Even though he liked the people, knew the parents well, liked the friends, did not want to go. And that stuff was always the hard stuff for me.
Yeah. And that is really the hard stuff. I think, I don't know, in my experience, especially when you have a child who is, you know, in that kind of profoundly gifted, so that, you know, cognitively in some areas they're just like off and running, but then you get that asynchronicity in terms of their social or emotional, and it's sort of like it's really hard to find a way to meet the needs of both, you know, because the last thing you want to do is put too much pressure or expectation supporting, you know, because you want to support the strength, you know, of course, and it's like doing that in a way that isn't, you know, raising those expectations, isn't kind of pushing them, but it's just acknowledging that, you know, even though they're these kind of amazing kids, a psychologist once said to me, it doesn't matter if they read the same textbook at 5, 6, and then 7, because my child was complaining he'd read all the books in the house. And because at 5, they're going to get something different out of it compared to when they're 6, compared to when they're 7, because there's so much going on in these complex brains and where they are emotionally and socially and all this other stuff, that we don't have to feel so much pressure parenting, because you get that pressure of having to fill the cup. It's like, oh, we better do lectures and workshops to, you know, do this stuff, without kind of realize actually it doesn't matter if they revisit, they're going to get something different one year from the next. And that was quite liberating for me as a parent. So what you say there about, you know, still wanting to co-sleep and being afraid of the dark definitely resonates. It's just, I couldn't agree more. We have to kind of lower the expectations of where everyone tells us they should be, what should happen, and just kind of go, well, where are you at? Yeah.
And also, I think remembering that the two things, if you think about it, really does make sense, because they have a brain that is constantly taking in all the information all the time from everywhere. So they can hear a cat yowl down the street, sounds awful, and they can hear the possums on the roof, and they're remembering a news story that was on in the shop that we walked through, and all of that's present all the time. So it kind of makes sense for them to be, wow, how do I deal with all of that? I think it must be easier to grow up when you deal with simply less, when you have less to process. And then on top of that, they have big emotional responses to that stimuli, as Kathleen said. That also takes a lot of processing to get a handle of it, to not let it beat you up every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Kathleen, did you want to jump in there?
Oh no, I'm going to agree with Rebecca. What she was saying is stuff that I've dealt with that myself. I've heard so many other stories from parents who had the same thing. It's just the actual hierarchy of the way things are supposed to develop, this, then this, then this, then this. I often say, you give me two different developmental milestones and I'll show you a kid who's reversed those particular two.
Oh, yeah.
Anything you can name, there'll be a kid out there who hasn't done it that way, and that's the way they need to develop. I mean, so it's taken me a long time to let go of those expectations of what should be and just live with what is.
Yeah.
So sometimes that means they're way ahead, and sometimes that means they're not wanting to leave the house ever, because that's the way it is, and you do what you can with the help and support that you can with medical and friends and family and finding things that work for the child. But you don't. I was going mad trying to make my kids something close to what they should be, and my own mental health was suffering. And when I let go of that and just went, they are who they are, they'll develop the way they develop, and I don't have to hold on to that anxiety that my children will never be able to be adults in the adult world. And it's just like, well, if they can't, well, then we'll support them. But if they can, they'll get there in their own time and in their own way.
Same, Kathleen, so much the same. It was about me letting go of, will they ever be able to? They will when they're ready.
Yeah.
And also, the more I pushed, the harder they dug in their heels.
I couldn't agree more. I remember vividly the moment that I let go of that desire or expectation to have a, I don't know, normal, in it, air quotes, family dinner at a table where people sat on chairs and ate with cutlery and ate like what was given to them and like ate all of it. Like dinner is, and I just kind of went, you know what? It's me. Then I don't know. I mean, that dinners weren't like that when I was a kid. It was totally dysfunctional. But I sort of thought this was something that I kind of valued as a parent. It's something that I wanted to, give to my kids. But then I'm like, actually, who does that? This is just, I'm sure no one actually pulls this off. So dinner for us is, there are chairs. People, I try to encourage bottoms to be on the chairs, but I mean, I've had a child go from sitting there to being on the ground. I'm like, how did that happen? And we've got lots of food sensitivities and quirks, and one loves runny cheese, one won't eat runny cheese. Oh, this food can't touch that food. And so I now do my latest strategy is a bit of a buffet style. Like I'll deconstruct dinner. So, for example, like the Humble bangers and mash will see meat sausages, vegetarian sausages, mashed potato, separated from vegetables and separated from gravy, and then people pick what they will eat.
Yeah.
And it's just like, what other meal? Now I'm like, what other meals can I present like this? with children variously falling off and getting off their chairs. Like, whatever.
I must admit, our solution has been to my youngest is 10, and she basically makes her own dinner because she never likes what we do. But I got some bento boxes.
Oh, yeah.
And the trick with those is they've got beautiful little cups in silicone and little things you can stick in it. So she can put her sultanas or the few veggies or fruit that she'll have in the little cup, and it'll be next to something else, but it won't touch it.
Yeah.
And it looks beautiful. And so she's willing to eat it because she prepared it. And when I say prepared, I mean it's an apple or it's a cover, and she's put them in the container. So, yeah, we again, letting go of expectations, as long as they're eating and it's vaguely healthy. That's...
Yeah, absolutely. You just let it go and get very creative in and like you say, meeting our kids where they're at. Because, I mean, we've talked about what giftedness is and asynchronicity, but of course, throwing into that mix is twice exceptionality and things like ADHD and autism. And there's a couple of articles from Kathleen within Perspectives about that, which are great, because one thing that I've been trying to find the research and information on is, well, what do those things look like with giftedness? Because I think often as parents, we come into this giftedness things because stuff is not going well, and giftedness gets thrown on the table, or sometimes another diagnosis first, or like for us, it's taken us a couple of years down the track to kind of go, okay, well, autism's a bit of a thing here, but it's hard to necessarily identify those things because the giftedness really throws it. Kathleen, perhaps you could tell us a bit about your articles and those topics.
Okay, well, I'll put at the front of this, the reason I even looked at this was simply because that's the diagnosis that my children and for me ended up with. So yeah, finding out, going through the journey of trying to find out, are my children, are they gifted? Yes, obviously. Are they autistic? Do they have ADHD? How can I judge it when I think my son saw 3 different professionals? My daughter's seen 2 or 3 before we actually finally figured out what was going on, because each one would look at a narrow piece. And I was like, how can this be so difficult? And when you start looking into it, you realize the reason it's so difficult is because no one's looked at it. No one's looked at giftedness and autism. They've looked at giftedness or autism. And there's not much crossover in the actual research. And if there's no crossover in the research, that doesn't get translated easily into clinical practice and diagnosis. So I know for many families, it's the diagnosis you get depends on who you go to see. If you go to see an expert in giftedness, they'll pick up on the giftedness, but they might miss the autism. If you go to see someone who's an expert on autism or ADHD, they'll pick those up, but they might miss the giftedness. Because, how do I put this? Like, for if you've got ADHD, you might, when you're doing the IQ test, you get bored. And you just, I'm done. That's what my son did on his first test. He got to the point and just said, I'm done. Because I told him when he was done, he could have chocolate cake. So he just, he did it until he could be bothered. And then he went, no, I'm done.
Bring on the chocolate cake.
Well, chocolate cake time. I'm done. I'm going. And so, so when you actually have a look at it, there's the best they've got at the moment, I think, is called it's the Burger White Meyer S&W heuristic. And I think that's from a university in Europe. And instead of looking at it as gifted and autistic, they had a look at what are the challenges, what are the talents, I suppose you'd say, or the things they're good at, what are the things they aren't good at, and have a look at how those two interact, and can you find interventions that work for the children without worrying about what the label is.
Yeah.
And I really like that, because it's more of what you'd call a strength-based approach, where you actually have a look at what the kids are good at and try and use that to help with the deficits. I know that's a real problem with, I'll say in schools, but it's also in homeschooling if you're not careful. And in that you can so focus on fixing the deficits that you don't give the children a chance to shine, and you don't realize that letting them say, look at their passion project, can rope them in to helping with the things that they're not so good at. So, for example, they obsessed about Minecraft. So you get them to do a talk about Minecraft, because then they're practicing how to talk to people. Or you try and teach reciprocal conversations through those kind of methods. And so that's kind of where the very cutting edge of research. The last time I looked, I'm a bit out of date, but last time I looked it was. But it can be really, really tough, because the characteristics, even within that cutting edge stuff, they found that some of the kids that were gifted and autistic didn't show up on the tests that are the gold standard, and vice versa. So some of them that were just gifted came out as autistic when they weren't. So that was a real problem with the autism stuff. But there's another thing that is a major problem with autism and ADHD research, and that's the absence of girls and women. So at the moment we have, I think autism has a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 times as many boys diagnosed as girls. And when you actually have a look at that, the actual average IQ of the girls is lower, which led them to realize that what was actually happening was that they were missing the average and high IQ girls with autism diagnosis, and the same with ADHD, and because they present differently. So autistic girls are, for instance, better at masking and appearing neurotypical, better at learning scripts. And of course, the smarter you are, and the more passions you have, the better you are at creating those little scripts that you can go, okay, in this situation, I can do this, and then this situation I'll say this, and in this situation I'll say that, and you've got the little scripts in your head. And because you're incredibly bright, you're able to cope a little bit better with the upsets. The things don't go to plan because you're spending more time obsessing about the way things can go wrong. And unfortunately, though that sounds just fine, the problem is masking actually has in the long term very bad mental health issues associated with it, which I didn't talk about in the articles. But they found that autistic people who mask end up with worse mental health outcomes in their lifetime than those who don't. And I think similar for ADHD. The really interesting thing for me with the ADHD one was that gifted children with ADHD don't have below average working memory deficits, which is one of the hallmarks of the ADHD diagnosis. They got less than many of their other scores on an IQ test, but the working memory isn't necessarily a negative. But because their brains are wanting to do so much work, they can't keep up with remembering how to do things compared to where their brain wants to go. So it's very frustrating. And sorry, I'm just rambling, but I was thinking the other bit that was worth talking about is that for boys who have a high IQ, their actual presentation matches that for girls. in the research they've done. So when we actually have a look and we go, well, ADHD is average or below average represented in high IQ kids, we go, is that right? Is that actually true? We don't know, because if we're missing all the ADHD girls, and we really are, the research, it's just not there. You could actually rename most of the research where it says ADHD in children, just cross out children, write boys with one or two girls.
Yeah.
Because that's usually what's there. But for high IQ boys, they look like they're ADHD. And if we're missing the girls, we're missing the high IQ boys. And as a result, there's probably far more gifted kids with ADHD out there that haven't been diagnosed because they don't match the current clinical presentation. That I found fascinating.
Exactly, Kathleen. It is really, really interesting stuff. When I very first took my girl to the first psychologist I wanted to see about an assessment with her was just one of the university clinics, where they have somebody who's qualified and they're waiting for their paperwork to come through, and she's doing work with a supervisor watching her practicing, if you like. And she was going to assess my child, and I knew I was in trouble because the paperwork that arrived beforehand was all about developmental delays and things that my kid had problem with. And I wanted to say, well, my child's problem with is that she talks too much and she asks far too many questions that nobody can keep up with. Where's the space for that? There's no developmental delay there. And then when we got into the room, she ran rings around the psychologist. And I watched the psychologist lose control of the conversation. And I thought, you are not going to be able to assess this kid. And then the second psychologist that I saw, I said, this kid, we know she's really, really bright, but she makes 5,000 different messes a day. I will walk into a room and, I'll think, I know you did 2 different lots of cooking and you did this collage that you're working on in a comic book and you edited a little video, and I know that you're out playing with the chickens and you spent some time in the pool. And then at the end of the day, I'll walk into my bedroom and find that there is a soft toy tea party on the bed. And I'm like, when did you have time for that? And that psychologist said, oh, she can't be ADHD because she's finishing everything. And I bought that at the time, but the more I've read, and also when I just plain listen to the conversation where she'll want to tell me about her day at school and a pet, and she's thinking about this particular comic that she read, and do I remember when she was 4, and all in one breath. And that's why I started to go, you know what, I don't care what the paperwork says, whatever profiles you're saying, I think what I'm watching here is a mental hyperactivity that goes with your physical hyperactivity. The physical side of it's coming down now. She's 12, she's in high school. It's much cooler to wear all black and hunch over and go, I don't wanna. But talk to her, and it's just a waterfall of questions and ideas. And what Kathleen is saying about girls not being diagnosed, I'm like, well, I now believe that 100% because of what's in my house.
You bet. I mean, it's taken years for us to cotton on to our kids because they hide it, they mask it. It's subtle. Yeah. And where it's not subtle, it gets written off as gifted or related to some other challenge. For years it was, well, they're playing by themselves because they can't communicate well enough because of the speech challenges. Now it's like, well, that could have been an issue, but actually that's probably got more to do with lack of skills around playing due to being autistic. And it's not until you get some hindsight that you can start to unpack those things. So it's really interesting what you say about that research with obviously with girls, they're just not being identified, and also the high IQ boys and ADHD. I just find that fascinating. I think it just shows us how I don't know, how little work we've done, how much more work we need to do in really understanding the impact of giftedness and what it really looks like. I know for myself, I will always credit going backpacking at age 29 for learning how to small talk. You know, I went by myself and I went through like China, Mongolia, Russia, and Europe, and ended up in the UK. And I had to learn how to talk to people. And I just learned a script. You know, I learned, oh, well, if I say these things, people just talk, and then I'll just ask this and prompt that and share this. And it was basically the same conversation I had from one side of the planet to the other. And it was just, you know, and it was just something that I learned and practiced during that time, and then was able to carry forward. But it never occurred to me that everyone else didn't do that as well. That wasn't just, you know, that was part of my quirk. I just assumed, I don't know. Didn't really think about what everyone did, or just thought I was an introvert, you know.
Yeah. On a similar topic for my ADHD, I didn't realize everyone else could remember names. So I
do.
I spent until I was diagnosed in my 30s after my daughter was diagnosed. And yes, so many of the characteristics that they were saying, well, this is ADHD. I'm saying, no, that's normal.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. And then when I had a look at it, it's like, oh, ADHD people struggle with remembering names. So when you're introduced to someone, you say, hi, oh, nice to meet you. My name is Rachel. Oh, nice to meet you, Rachel. 3 minutes later, I've forgotten their name. And then, of course, the next day you meet them and they'll say, hi, Kathleen, good to see you again. I'll go, I know you. I can tell you, about, all the things we talked about. I've got no idea what your name is. Hi, lovely to meet you. How's, so I spent years developing ways around not saying someone's name. I found that after about the 5th time you asked someone's name, they'd assumed that you didn't actually care about them. And it was even worse when they were a good friend and you've forgotten their name. And because it was years ago, it got more and more awkward to ask their name as the years went on. And you're like, I know you. You're a good friend. I know everything about you. I've got no idea what your name is. And it's one of the wonderful things about social media is names are there. And the photo. So I can go, that's so on here. It's like, that's Rebecca. Oh, that's Sophia. I don't have to remember anymore. Yeah. And that was a massive advantage for me. But it was something that everyone else just seemed to intuitively do. It never occurred to me that was a disability, or that's something that was not intuitive for other people.
I can do people's names. That's one of my mutant powers. Drives my husband insane. But if I need lists to remember what I've got to do and where I've got to do it. And I mean, Andrew and I moved in together at 23, and I was 23, and he was making fun of me because I always had lists. I need a list of this and this. And that was the thing. I just thought I was being very well organized, and then didn't really realize, actually, if you took away my lists, I would have been stuck in the middle of the living room, not knowing what to do. Probably would watch TV for the rest of the day. Because I, as Kathleen, I developed this thing that allowed me to function. And it was, I always, if you go through my bag right now, you'll find 4 or 5 different lists with other notes written on the side of them. I used to write on my arm when I was a child. My dad used to go, have some dignity. Don't be writing on yourself. But I knew I couldn't lose that list.
I'm laughing because I'm like, I'm resonating with both of you. I'm like terrible with names and faces. And I'm dead without a list. Like, absolutely. I'm like, what? Everyone doesn't do this.
Yeah, exactly. And I've got a sister who's now 51. And she is just starting to use app lists with her husband because they can share the load that way. But she didn't used to need a list to tell her what to do every single day. She never had that to function. She just knew you get up and you have a shower and then you got dressed and you have breakfast and then you go to work. And at lunchtime, you pop over to the chemist and get the paracetamol that you run out of. She just did it. Whereas if I didn't have all that written down, I'd be dashing out the door late with my shirt on backwards.
Which I spent 30 years doing.
Yeah.
I have buzzy things on my phone.
Oh, yes.
Buzzy things tell me that now is the time to do the thing.
Yes.
And if the buzzy doesn't go, it doesn't happen. So I've missed expensive appointments, very expensive appointments, because the buzzy didn't go. And so I've had to learn ways around my own thing. But I'm asynchronous as well. There's stuff that sticks in there that no one else can do. There's some things that I can do that other people find tricky. Like I actually love reading science papers. So, and I know a lot of people, even researchers, find that really difficult. But I love digging into that, and I can just hold it in here. But not everyone can. But it's that asynchronous thing of these things are easy, these things are hard, but they're not the same as what the average neurotypical non-gifted person can do. They're literally the inverse.
I don't want to read scientific papers, but give me some critical theory, some French discourse analysis, and I'm a happy kid, you know. But ask me to clean my living room or clean my desk. Oh my goodness. My husband is coaching me through 10 minutes a day on your desk, Beck, 10 minutes a day on your desk, because my desk is the most frightening thing in the house. And some days I can do that 10 minutes, and some days I kind of hover around the doorway to the study and decide even cleaning the living room floor would be better than this. I just can't pick up a pile of papers and go, these things need to be filed. I shall now file them. That's hard.
Yeah.
Much rather sit there and read a deep critical theoretical analysis of power structures.
I love that. And it does seem to be the trend. A couple of months ago, read The Power of Different by Gail Saltz. And that's a really lovely read because it talks about all the different neurodivergencies and their strengths and weaknesses. And it's sort of trying to focus on, well, what are the strengths? It's not all about the deficit, you know, in terms of ADHD and autism. So it's a really nice read in terms of, all right, we know we've talked, these what the deficits are. We've talked about those, but actually what goes with that are these strengths for all of these different things. And I think, you know, we really need to extrapolate that out to giftedness as well. And I think that's what's often missed. It's like everyone will focus on that strength and think giftedness is just all about looking this particular way without understanding that what seems to be happening in our brains is that we get strengths along with certain weaknesses. We can do this, but it kind of comes at a little bit of a cost over here. But the upside is we can do this kind of cool thing, which is really either creative or intense, and not everyone can do that. But we've just got to accept that, all right, in these areas, we need to give ourselves some slack or a bit of support or find tools or strategies in order to maximize that particular strength that we get. And I think having read your articles and that book, Perspectives on Giftedness, it's really nicely, really cuts to the heart of a lot of the big kind of issues and I think shifts that we need in our thinking around giftedness. So congratulations for wonderful articles. Thank you very much for being that person, reading those discourses and science, you know, research, and distilling that out for the rest of us, because there's a lot of really, I don't think I've read an article yet where I haven't had an aha moment or a yes moment. They've just been brilliant. And thank you so much for coming along today. It's been a lovely chat, and it's been absolutely gorgeous to meet you guys.
Thank you for having us. It's been lovely.
Yeah, it has. It's lovely to meet other people who go, yes, that's, you know. And Kathleen, I've liked your work for a long time. I really liked Gifted Myths, and I have pushed it on people that I have met because it's useful. You know, it's a really useful bit of work. So hurry up and write another one in your spare time.
In your spare time. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to reading that, and I hope it wasn't too scary today. So thank you for coming and chatting. And just to let everyone know, links for websites and social media for Kathleen and Rebecca in the show notes, as well as a link to Perspectives on Giftedness and Kathleen's books about myths, history and science. I'm like, oh, it's the science and the history. That's so exciting. So, and as I edit and, back through this podcast, I'll be like, oh, what was that reference? Oh, there's a longitudinal study. Where's the name? And I'll be looking all these things up. So thank you for sharing all those tidbits and knowledge. Certainly amongst people who enjoy a good old, chat about data and trends and comparisons and whatnot. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophia Elliott. As a parent of 3 gifted kids, I'm here to talk about all things gifted because I've been isolated and uncertain, and I felt like that parent. Then I found peace of mind, support, and my community. This podcast is about sharing that journey, actually parenting gifted kids, and connecting with advice and support. So we have everything we need for every member of our family to thrive. This is the Our Gifted Kid podcast.